Alright, my name is Sydney Moore and I will be presenting on the 1918 Spanish flu, how the New York Times covered the pandemic. So why is this topic important? Media and how the news has presented has changed drastically over the past 100 years. Analyzing how news presented major world events in the past can help us compare to how media has changed and presents these similar events in today's society. For example, how the New York Times presented for COVID-19 versus how they presented over 100 years ago for the 1918 Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was the biggest pandemic in history before COVID-19, and the New York Times was a major newspaper, so how they covered this event was extremely important for many Americans. Radio came into play early in the 1900s, causing issues for many newspapers and concern that radio would completely wipe out newspapers and how they presented media. The Radio Act of 1912 marked the first time Congress attempted to actually regulate the new technology, which was at the time known as the wireless telegraph. The act put radio waves in control of the government, which divided the bandwidths up for different uses. So they had some uses for military, some uses for entertainment, some for news. Newspapers were very afraid that during that time that they would become obsolete due to the booming use of radio in World War I and beyond. Yet it held onto its stronghold for years to come, and a newspaper continued to be a major faucet for media for many years. The end of World War I was brought on in the fall of 1918. The United Nations was formed in December 1918. This is actually a clip from the New York Times during December 1918 discussing the formation of the United Nations, which they called a League of Nations at the time. They were talking about France, Italy, Russia, some other central powers who refused because they didn't want peace. And this article is essentially talking about the reason why they would not want to join what was then called the League of Nations. The U.S. came home finally in fall of 1918. The first cases of the Spanish flu were found within Fort Riley in the spring of 1918, but it was not accurately reported and was not known at the time as the Spanish flu. It was just thought to be mild cases of influenza. The start of the pandemic was in the fall of 1918. The reason it is called the Spanish flu is due to the fact that Spain was neutral throughout the war and was not very open about reporting their flu cases. Were very open about reporting their flu cases versus many other countries who hid their reports. The flu was thought to have originated from Spain and hence was labeled the Spanish flu. It's actually suspected that the flu started in the British camps during World War I and was spread to other armies. The start of the flu was actually hidden from the public for a good majority of 1918 when it started. There was a small wave of Spanish flu in the spring of 1918 that everyone thought was just a regular case of influenza. Some New York Times articles, including this one below, no influenza in our army. Washington has had no reports about German forces. Shows that they were trying to push back the amount of cases that were being reported and hiding the severity of the pandemic as well. This is a brief clip about the Spanish flu. of the height of the pandemic, hospitals were extremely overcrowded. You'll see that they even took over gymnasiums and other areas and turned them into refuges for people who were sick with the Spanish flu. Hospitals were completely overrun, nurses were understaffed, and some of this might sound very similar to what we have just experienced. Again, a lot of makeshift beds, gymnasiums being repurposed into hospital beds. It was a very difficult time for the entire country and the entire world. According to the Center for Disease Control, 195,000 Americans died in October of 1918 alone. This is when the first major wave of the Spanish flu hit. In less than 2 years, an estimated 25 million people in the United States, which was 25% of the total population of 103 million people, became ill, and 675,000 people died. Times writes articles describing ways to help prevent the combat of Spanish flu, such as wearing a gauze mask and quarantine for those under suspicion of influenza. There was another article presented on February 9th of 1920 titled "Needless Exposure to Influenza," and was a letter to the editor of the Times from a physician. This physician highlighted the utmost importance of cutting down unnecessary social gatherings. So this is the actual full clip itself. You can see below, New York, February 7th, 1920. To the editor of the New York Times, as a physician, I wish to protest against needless exposure to influenza and to appeal to the good sense of the public in this regard. Several instances of influenza contracted by social calls and calls to show interest upon those known to be ill with this disease have come under my observation. In none of these was the visited person at all benefited by the call. Should the caller become infected, there is immediately a new focus of infection capable of spreading the disease to any number of others who might have escaped, thereby putting an extra drain upon already overburdened hospitals, nurses, and doctors. By all means, help when able, but do avoid impractical, sentimental calls. So again, this rings true to what we just saw through the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, nurses, hospitals crying out, telling people to stay home, stay away from others, avoid any sort of contact when necessary, especially with people that are infected. There were 3 major waves of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Some countries actually had a 4th in 1920, but it started approximately in spring of 1918, then fall 1918, which was the most deadly of the 3, and finally spring 1919, and infected as many as 500 million people worldwide, which was about 1/3 of the global population at the time. Mortality estimates vary anywhere from 20 to 50 to upwards of 100 million people based on estimates. Records were not as well kept during that time, so it was a little bit harder to see exactly how many were killed. Worldwide, in a few months, the virus had claimed more people than the 4 years of World War I. Lessons learned from the 1918 pandemic. Times commended the use of advertising throughout the epidemic to spread awareness and keep people safe in 1918. Hygiene conditions in the battlefield of World War I during the final year of the war were absolutely appalling. The war had drained so much of the nation's medical resources that it was difficult to keep up with the pandemic and the needs that it brought on. The outbreak was first identified in the U.S. in military personnel in spring 1918, as I mentioned before, in Fort Riley in Kansas. The outbreaks within states were often traceable back to Army military bases and hospitals, such as in Minneapolis. We see traces of advertising to protect from COVID-19 and how they advertised during the Spanish flu. So for example, on the left-hand side, this is an advertisement for 1920 talking about the diet during and after influenza. This is Horlicks malted milk. It's very nutritional, very digestible. And then on the left, you've got an advertisement for a medication. If it's COVID, Paxlovid, that is the medication that they use to treat people with COVID-19, this type of medication that they use. The New York Times continues on. The New York Times was a major media outlet during the 1918 Spanish flu and continued to be so into the 2000s. Many looked at the Times for information through the Spanish flu and also during COVID-19. The importance of print media media and unbiased journalism continue to be strong even today. Thank you so much for your time.